Hello, and welcome to the celebration of Berkeley Psychology's 100th anniversary. I'm Raka Ray, Dean of the Division of the Social Sciences, the largest academic unit at UC Berkeley. Tonight, we recall that a century ago, Berkeley Psychology became their own department, independent from their previous home in the philosophy department. Berkeley students and faculty have since led the field. Psychology has evolved into a place that peer institutions observe to see where the discipline is headed. I am proud to say that they have consistently been ranked as the top department in the country, and they continue to foster a dynamic and innovative community as they evolve. As you listen to a small group of our esteemed faculty and students tonight, I know that you will enjoy the breadth of teaching and research that they have to share. I expect that you will be inspired by the positive impact they create for all of our society, as I am, at a moment that needs such research more than ever. As we begin our program, congratulations to all of you, our graduates and friends and colleagues. Thank you for all that you do in support of the people who make this department remarkable. I look forward to seeing you at upcoming events marking this special anniversary, and we hope to host you in Berkeley Psychology's new home at Berkeley Way West later this spring. A couple of housekeeping points. I do want to let you know that closed captioning is available. To enable closed captioning, please click the CC button at the bottom right of the screen. Also, we will be recording today's event, and the video will be made available on the website of the Department of Psychology. A special thank you to the department chair, the remarkable Serena Chen, and her team for helping to organize this celebration. And with that, I'm so pleased to pass things over to Chair Chen to introduce the program.
Thank you, Dean Ray, so much for your welcoming remarks and for being here today to help us kick off our psychology department's 100th year anniversary. And thank you all out there from near and far, from the past and the present, for logging in today to join our celebration. As I look at the number of participants going up, it's both exciting and heartening to see such a wonderful turnout. Today, as I sit here and I reflect on the history of our department, starting with its relatively humble beginnings back years ago, 1922, to where we now stand 100 years later as a world-renowned Department of Psychology, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe on the one hand and a little bit of collective pride on the other. Our current standing is a fairly remarkable achievement for a public university in the modern era. To maintain our stature, psychology has had to adapt to many challenges along the way. Changing zeitgeist in the field, multiple campus funding crises, increasing competition year after year for graduate students and faculty from other top universities, overseeing advising, staffing a growing and exciting undergraduate major, of course, moving into Berkeley Way West recently, and so on. From an initial beginning of only 4 faculty, come this January, we will be 38 strong, representing a broad spectrum of the psychological field. Over these decades, our faculty and graduate students have made significant contributions to our understanding of many important topics and issues: mental illness, intergroup dynamics, close relationships, the developing brain, emotion, all sorts of emotions, those emotions, neuroplasticity, prejudice and racism and how to reduce them, the importance of sleep, the neural underpinnings of decision-making, language development, and so on. The list is long. Our faculty and graduate students have been recognized with numerous accolades over the years for their various contributions. But I think the measure of a department's strength and success lies as much more than just in awards, publications, grants, and the like. Over the past century, we've served as the intellectual home, a community for cohort after cohort of faculty and students or with us virtually. We've passed on knowledge and training in the lecture hall, in our labs, helping to equip future generations of scholars, practitioners, everyday people, like everybody here in the Zoom room today, equipping people with important psychological tools that they can use to understand and better personal lives, but also society more broadly. Today, we've come together to celebrate what we and our predecessors have accomplished while gearing up for the next 100 years. To do so, what we're going to do is take a journey of sorts through the eyes of a handful of speakers who collectively represent our departmental history. We'll first hear from one of our distinguished emeriti professors. We'll then hear some of the exciting research and findings coming from labs of 4 of our current faculty. And then we'll turn to the future of our department, hearing from one of our rising doctoral students and then a rising undergraduate psychology major. So I hope you enjoy this journey of ours. We're going to start off our celebratory, as I said, with one of our emeriti Professor Emerita Rhona Weinstein. Rhona Weinstein has long studied the dynamics of how teachers' beliefs about their students' abilities, easily understood by young children, become self-fulfilling prophecies. She's also long been interested in features of classrooms and schools that can promote educational equity for all children. Among her many honors, she received the Distinguished Contribution to Theory and Research in Community Psychology Award from the American Psychological Association. Rhona, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Serena. On behalf of our vibrant emeriti faculty, I welcome you to this kickoff celebration for the 100th anniversary of our department. We're as old as our oldest emeriti, former chair Al Riley, just short of 100, who arrived in 1950 and who, during his retirement after his exciting research at Berkeley, spearheaded the successful learning and retirement program for the entire campus, now in its 23rd year. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. We had a before story before 1922, and it places our roots first in the English department in a psychology club somewhere in the 1870s and early 1880s, chaired by Chair Roland Sill, and 3 of the 4 undergraduates who were part of this group later served as presidents of the APA. And second, in the philosophy department, where George Howison taught the first course in psychology in 1888, and his student, George Malcolm Stratton, established the first psychological laboratory in 1896. As Jean McFarland noted, this embryonic period of psychology ended after severe labor pains. Given the press for an empirical science and the smell of rats saturating the carpets drove the philosophers out of the building. In 1922, 4 faculty, Olga Bridgman, George Stratton, appointed chair, Warner Brown, and Edward Chase Tolman founded an independent department of psychology. It was first housed in that philosophy building, then life sciences, then Tolman Hall, and since 2018, Berkeley Way. We had our activists. The battle over academic freedom at Berkeley was waged by Tolman in the early 1950s. He refused to sign the loyalty oath, was fired, and then rehired. The battle for gender equity in the late 1960s had as one of its leaders Susan Irvin Tripp. Despite the fact that the first 4 PhD graduates were women, despite 2 faculty females at the start, Bridgman and McFarland, it would take 47 years, almost half this history, before a cohort of 5 women was hired on affirmative action, and Susan Irvin Tripp transferred into psychology from rhetoric in the 1970s. And this happened after a scathing academic Senate report, a court case, and a US Department of Justice complaint. I am the happy recipient of a voting seat at the faculty table, able to see the innovative policies established at Berkeley. Women reach parity in appointments. The first faculty of color, Enrico Jones in 1974 and Serena Chen in 2000, and the first female chair, Karen D. Valois, in 1998. Our early forays in psychology were rooted in the observation of clinical problems in child development, as well as in the experimental study of animals. Among many advances since then, interdisciplinary work has become the norm, from gene to society. We saw the cognitive revolution replace behaviorism, clinical science adopt trans-diagnostic approaches with validated treatments brought to scale, a neuroscience explosion in the study of mind-brain relationships, ecologically embedded research, and attention to cultural and structural factors that impact development, relationships, social problems, and well-being. Psychology at UC Berkeley continues to be a deeply cherished setting, committed to the thriving of a diverse all. We have extraordinary faculty, extraordinary staff, whose partnership fuels innovative work. We're blessed with amazing students who make teaching joyous and spark mutual learning. And many of us spent our entire careers at this great university, building community, as Serena noted, and institutional investments. May we continue to support bold advances in psychological science, its discoveries, its teaching of the next generations, our future, and its applications in society at large.
Thank you so much, Rhona, for giving us a sense of some of the key figures and turning points in our department's history, and also where you entered into the department's history. This brings us now to the present, to the 4 lightning talks in which 4 of our current faculty will give you a sense of some of the ideas and research that are happening right now in their labs. Maybe not right now, but in the present day. I want to briefly mention and thank everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. Our speakers did get a chance to take a peek at them. We don't have the time or form exactly to answer questions, but the speakers may well answer some of your questions in the course of their talks. So we'll start off these 4 talks about the present with Dr. Silvia Bunge. Silvia is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Helen Neuroscience Institute. She directs here at Berkeley the Building Blocks of Cognition Lab. And today you're going to hear her talk about how does education change minds and brains. Okay, Silvia.
Thank you, Serena. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really pleased to be part of this momentous occasion. So I'd like to begin by introducing you to my lab. Here we are, in happier times outside of Berkeley Way. You'll be hearing from one of them later today, Monica Elwood-Lowe. So my lab is really interested in higher level cognitive abilities, such as reasoning and goal-directed behavior. And we study these in a number of ways. The first of these is that we look at underlying cognitive and neural processes. In other words, the building blocks of these high-level abilities. The second one is that we're interested in how they develop and what explains the individual differences between people in reasoning and goal-directed behavior. And finally, last but not least, we're also interested in how life experiences, both positive and negative, affect the development of these higher level abilities. So today I'm going to talk about a question that really gets at the heart of what we're all doing here at UC Berkeley, which is how does education change minds and brains? So a recent Cal grad might be wondering, now what? What skills do I have to bring to the table? What can I use from my time at Berkeley in my career moving forward? So many of our students at UC Berkeley are going to go on to become knowledge workers, that is, people who create value through their knowledge and ideas. And, you know, there's this rapid pace of discovery and innovation, and knowledge is constantly being overturned. And there's no way that we can teach our undergrads or graduate students, for that matter, everything that they're going to need in order to tackle future challenges. And so what they need most of all are going to be strong cognitive abilities, general abilities like abstract reasoning that will allow them to learn new concepts and solve novel problems. But this is the tricky thing. How do we develop these general cognitive abilities? Well, are they honed by education? The ancient Greeks certainly thought so when they were starting to implement what is now our modern Western educational system. So for example, Socrates and Plato believed that they needed to train future rulers in mathematics and other complex topics because it would help them to cultivate reasoning skills that would allow them to think about politics and ethics. And even today, our investment in education is based on this idea that formal schooling hones general kinds of skills that help students become productive members of society. But were the ancient Greeks right? So can practicing these general cognitive abilities in one content area and one context actually transfer to novel ones? Well, actually, believe it or not, this has been debated in a heated way for over 100 years, and we're nowhere closer to resolving this problem. So research from both cognitive science and education suggests that learning is often highly specific. There's very little transfer across contexts and content. But that typically has been based on very narrowly focused interventions, trying to just focus on solving one particular type of task. And so my grad student, Elena Lieb, and I have argued that immersive, multifaceted, and protracted kinds of learning experiences, like the kinds you get with education, are more promising. And so my lab has tried to test this. It's not an easy thing to test, but we've looked at, first of all, effects of overall educational attainment, as well as effects of a course on reasoning. And I'll tell you a bit about both of these. So the first is just what is the effect of overall having attained higher education in your life? I was thinking about this in terms of the fact that many cognitive abilities peak in early adulthood and then begin to decline very depressingly. And so this is just a measure of just multiple cognitive abilities. It's true for many of them. And so I started thinking about, why is there this peak and decline in the early 20s? Is that because most of the people who've been studied have ended their higher education at that point, and then are no longer challenged again in quite the same way and to the same extent as they are in school? And so we sought to ask that question: does the age at which you see peak cognitive function actually depend on how much schooling you complete? And we did a study with a large group of participants, and we showed some evidence for this, that regardless of where you start with cognitive functioning, the age at which you see peak functioning depends on how much education you completed. So people who only completed high school, peak functioning occurred around age 17 or 18. This is relevant to when that old expression of people peaking in high school. People who attained a bachelor's, their peak happened later, master's, professional, PhD, even later. So there's a really big difference here. Now this is suggestive, but it's not at all conclusive. And so we've tried to get at this another way. And the central hypothesis is that education that emphasizes reasoning strengthens the underlying neural machinery, the underlying brain mechanisms, via experience-dependent brain plasticity. So just like repeated practice that shapes the brain. And so we have tested for changes in a brain network that we know, based on a lot of research from my lab and other labs, that it supports reasoning across a broad range of tasks shown here. And we also know that this brain network matures slowly over childhood and adolescence, and we think it has a chance to be affected by these outside experiences. My lab has shown, for example, that the strength of connections, the cabling, the wiring between these distant brain regions actually predicts the development of reasoning. And by the way, this is the Golden Gate Bridge being built right there in the 1930s. So to test this central hypothesis, we were looking around for some kind of real world course that emphasizes reasoning. And we settled on the law school admission test. 150,000 adults take this test every year, and they study like crazy for it. And 2/3 of the test actually focuses on reasoning. So we conducted a number of studies using a number of different measures over a few years. This is an example of one of the types of problems that you see on the LSAT test. So you have a set of, just a basic little puzzle here. You have a set of rules, and you need to integrate all the information from the rules to deduce the correct solution. And so we wanted to know, does training on these kinds of very specific kinds of problems transfer to other kinds of reasoning problems? So we tested that using a set of different reasoning measures, comparing people who were randomly assigned to complete the reasoning section of the course or the reading comprehension section. And so we showed that there were improvements for the reasoning group in a number of different tasks that also tap into reasoning, but that look very different from the ones that you just saw. All right. We also saw that people's eye movements when they're trying to solve one of these problems actually got more efficient if they completed this reasoning course. So we're starting to get here at the mechanisms of change. And then we also looked at the brain. So in this study, we looked at the effects of 100 hours of overall LSAT course prep on the brain. And what we found was, looking at the brain regions that support reasoning, there were stronger connections between them in terms of the strength of communication or functional coupling between brain regions in an fMRI study. And we also, so it looks like the neural machinery is being strengthened. And we went one step further and we looked at a measure that's related to white matter connections, the cabling in the brain. And our evidence suggests that there were stronger anatomical connections after just these roughly 100 hours or 3 months of training. So this looks pretty promising. Were the ancient Greeks right? Well, this is proof of concept, at least, that education can hone general cognitive skills, and that it does so by strengthening these brain circuitry that supports reasoning. You know, here at Berkeley, we're training future knowledge workers, and they will forget much of the content of what we're feeding them, and that doesn't matter as long as they're honing the abilities needed to solve novel problems. So in future, I'd like to continue to study this, but looking at kids' brains when they're still under construction, how education is shaping the brain and cognition in that time. We've done some work on this, but there's a lot left to be done. And also in this day and age, I've just gotten very, concerned with misinformation and bias. And I'm very interested in figuring out how we can teach students and also ourselves to reason more objectively in the face of all this craziness. So I'd like to end by thanking my lab and everybody, and opening it up to questions via email later on.
Thank you so much, Silvia. That was so interesting. And we will also save the chat because I see there are questions coming in there too, and we'll distribute them to the speakers afterward as well. Okay, we have our second speaker, Allison Harvey, who's a professor in our department, and she also directs the Golden Bear Sleep and Mood Research Clinic. Allison is going to talk about mental health and sleep health challenges ahead.
Thank you so much, Serena. So I'm super excited to be here tonight, and I am going to share 3 of the many challenges that clinical psychological scientists face. And I'm going to give you a taster of some of the solutions that we're developing here in the psychology department at UC Berkeley. A first set of challenges arise because psychiatrists and clinical psychologists tend to focus on single mental health challenges. So to give an example, my PhD was focused on post-traumatic stress disorder. My postdoc was focused on social anxiety disorder. And my early faculty research was focused on insomnia. These are all single mental health challenges. However, the epidemiologists show us that when we have mental health challenges, we actually tend to have 2 or more. This is known as comorbidity. And when we took a look in our data on among patients who have sleep and circadian problems, we did find a lot of comorbidity. In fact, 90% of the patients met criteria for more than one sleep or circadian problem. So if we deliver a treatment for a single disorder like insomnia to these people, we may not be serving them in the best way that we possibly can. So as one pathway toward working on a solution to this challenge, we've been asking this question: can we develop one treatment that might be helpful across the various sleep and circadian disturbances, across mental health challenges as well? The first version of this treatment is called the Transdiagnostic Intervention for Sleep and Circadian Dysfunction. So this is a treatment that aims to reverse psychological processes that cause and/or maintain sleep and circadian problems. And we specifically devised it to be scalable. It's 8 treatment sessions, and each session's 50 minutes in duration. So we've conducted 2 studies so far on this approach, one with 180 teenagers and one with 121 adults who have a severe mental disorder. Now, in both of these studies, sleep and circadian problems greatly improved. But in addition to that, there were several other improvements that we observed. So, for example, in this second study, we took a measure of mental health symptoms. In the red here, we have the people who received the transdiagnostic treatment for sleep and circadian problems. Also, they got usual care. And we have a comparison group here in blue who just got usual care. As you can see, if you got the sleep treatment, you had a reduction in mental health symptoms from before to after the treatment, and this was maintained till 6-month follow-up. So this is pretty exciting. It means that if we can treat sleep problems and circadian problems, we can improve anxiety, depression, mania, delusions, hallucinations, etc. And it's also encouraging because it suggests that it is possible to develop one simple, scalable treatment that can meet the complex needs of patients. A second challenge arises from these data. A staggering 1 in 10 of us will meet diagnostic criteria for a mental health challenge in any 12-month period. Suicide is a leading cause of death and is often associated with mental health challenges. Moreover, sleep problems, which are intimately entwined with our mental health, are very prevalent too. Given these prevalence rates and the potential for devastating consequences, I'm really concerned that our current approaches are far from sufficient. In my mind, at least part of the problem is that treatment development researchers like myself tend to assume if we build it, they will come. In other words, if we develop the treatment, we test it, we show it works, it will magically be available in a routine practice setting. That is not the case. There's data to show that only a small percentage of the treatment innovations any of us are working on will ever reach routine practice settings. Moreover, those that do, there will be a lag of 15 to 20 years. So closing this gap between science and practice is a major priority, and it's brought about a brand new field of science called implementation science. This field is flourishing and is very exciting. It's garnering support from NIH and other funding bodies. And I want to share one of the questions we're asking that within the implementation science realm. Here's the question: how do we implement new evidence-based treatments in a routine practice setting? The routine practice settings we're working in are community mental health centers, or CMHCs. These are truly a unique national asset. They came about through Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. They're federally funded. No one is turned away. But there are a large number of people who need these services, and so they are very under-resourced. In these settings, we work with providers and we train them in the sleep and circadian treatment I just mentioned. And then we watch and collect data as those providers deliver the treatment to their clients who were diagnosed with severe mental disorders and sleep problems. So we can ask a bunch of questions in this study. Firstly, does the sleep treatment improve sleep and mental health and reduce substance use problems? Our pilot data suggests yes. We'll have to wait and see from when we get all of the study data. We've also embedded a number of implementation science questions. For example, does the intervention need to be adapted to fit the CMHC context? And how do we optimally train these extremely busy providers? And the all-important question of whether the implementation effort that we're extending sustains longer term. So this is just one example of a study that's trying to close the gap between science and practice. A third and final challenge I want to mention comes about because behavioral patterns like drinking too much alcohol, not sleeping enough, not exercising enough are major contributors to ill health and premature death. This reality has prompted the NIH to organize a group of researchers, including our team, to work on the science of behavior change. So I want to give you an example of one of our science of behavior change projects. In the course of treating sleep problems among teenagers, we observed something that surprised us. So the structure of the treatment session is that it's 50 minutes long. For the first 40 minutes, the teenager works with the sleep coach, working on their problems, their sleep problems. And then in the final 5 to 10 minutes, we invite parents in. We thought this would be a no-brainer. It would promote acceptance and reinforcement of change. So here's the surprise. We observed a lot of conflict between parents and their teenage children around sleep. So we decided we would ask whether or not we could work out an intervention that would support parents as they initiate hopefully inspiring conversations with their teenage children about engaging in sleep health behaviors. Our data from the initial study suggests that this intervention did result in less conflict. Moreover, it improved engagement in sleep health behaviors and also had some generalization because it allowed, it helped parents develop the skills to also have conversations about non-sleep related topics with their teenage children. So to wrap up, I've highlighted 3 of the many challenges that clinical psychological scientists are facing, and I've given a taster of some of the solutions being developed here in the psychology department. Finally, I want to thank the wonderful faculty collaborators I have the good fortune of working with, and a big thank you to the team who I am here representing today. And I want to thank you all for coming along to our celebration tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, for that wonderful talk. Okay, we're moving on to lightning talk number 3. We're going to hear from Rich Ivry, a professor in cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Psychology. He directs the Cognition in Action lab. His talk called Mining the Secrets of the Human Brain.
Thank you, Serena. Pleased to be part of this panel. And I'm going to try to share my screen there. Get rid of my floating. All right, well, lightning talk, so let's get at it. Whereas a slide like this usually features the collaborators on a research project, here I'm showing the team that I share a career with, the 12 members of the cognitive neuroscience area. Now, cognitive neuroscience is the newest area of the department, formed about 15 years ago. And you might ask, why a new area? And it's really about the methods. The frontiers of science are defined by the tools available for observation. As evidenced by these recent examples from the popular press, methodological developments paved the way for new breakthroughs in science. The bestseller, The Codebreaker, highlights Berkeley professor Jennifer Doudna and her pioneering work developing new tools to re-engineer our genetic code. Cognitive neuroscience emerged with the introduction of new methods to examine the relationship of the mind and brain. I highly recommend an article in this week's New Yorker that features 21st century approaches to mind reading, communicating with people thought to be in a deep coma, interpreting dreams, or providing speech to stroke patients who can't speak. These were all ideas of science fiction just a generation ago. Now, our founder, George Stratton, appreciated the importance of methods. Creating a Department of Psychology allowed him to venture off the armchair philosophy and into the lab. He used his $3,000 startup budget to arm his fellow experimentalists with the state-of-the-art tools of his time. The Geisler tubes and the Stern Innovator were used to precisely control lights and sounds, respectively. The HPP chronoscope allowed the experimenter to measure reaction times with millisecond accuracy. Closer to my own interest in sensory motor control was the pseudoscope, a lens that inverted and reverses the world. And here's a little video of me using this for the first time, wandering around the halls of Tolman. Oh, that is not me wandering the halls. Now you can see I'm highly confused and lost with this device on one eye. But by wearing the device for 8 days, Stratton became quite facile in moving about and performing manual actions.
You're right in front of it, Rich.
At least when he didn't think too hard about his actions.
You're right in front of those buttons.
The world, though, never looked normal to him.
Now down, down. You have to go down, down. Keep
Down is
down.
up. Okay. His motor system
Almost
eventually
there.
became recalibrated.
keep on going down. There it is. Yay.
There it is. But his cognitive system always remained fixed in an upright world. The phrase cognitive neuroscience was coined in the mid-1980s to reflect the growing interest in marrying the analytic logic of cognitive psychology with the tools of neuroscience. And Berkeley was not the ideal place to build a cognitive neuroscience program. Lacking a medical school, we didn't have ready access to patients with neurological disorders or clinical technologies to visualize the brain. But through collaborations and generous university investments, we were able to build a great program. Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, is one of the cornerstone methods. Our first machine was housed in a trailer off the Wellman Court, and about 10 years later, we moved it into the basement of the newly constructed Li Kai-shing building. Now, while MRI was developed to provide structural images of the human brain for diagnostic purposes, these are shown on the left, this method, in the 1980s, techniques were developed to use this device to measure in vivo brain activity. This approach, called functional MRI or fMRI, doesn't measure neural activity directly. Rather, it measures changes in blood oxygenation that result from neural activity. The red blobs shown on the right mark regions of the brain that consume more oxygen when people are reading words that convey emotional states compared to when reading words that are neutral in affective connotation. Now, in my final minutes, I want to give a whirlwind tour of some examples of how these imaging tools are being used by members of our cognitive neuroscience group in basic and translational research projects. Let me start with some work by Jack Gallen's lab to provide a detailed visualization of the organization of the mind. This endeavor can be quite challenging when dealing with a folded 3D structure like the cerebral cortex. And thinking in 3D can even be misleading when we recognize that the brain is really a continuous sheet, one that has been folded up to maximize surface area while making birth a reasonable exercise. To see the true organization, researchers have developed tools that graphically inflate the brain to to bring the folds to the surface and then flatten the brain so that it can be seen and appreciated as a continuous sheet. This slide shows a flat map of how the brain represents semantics, our conceptual knowledge of the world. The image is obtained by having people either listen to stories or watch movies, and then determine how each area of the brain, or what are called voxels, respond to different features, such as people, places, action, feelings, etc. While we shouldn't be surprised to see that conceptual knowledge is broadly distributed, it does force one to rethink our traditional models of how the brain supports language, models that have tended to highlight the importance of much more restricted networks. In my lab, we have applied similar methods to map out the cerebellum, tucked under the cerebral cortex here, or shown in detail over here. Now, this structure is traditionally associated with the motor system, but various lines of evidence indicate that the cerebellum may be important for coordinating complex cognition, perhaps in a way similar to how it helps us coordinate complex movement. The cerebellum is even more tightly convoluted than the cerebral cortex, so flat mapping is again an important tool for visualization. Here's a flat map of the visualization of the cerebellum. This is work that's been conducted by Maeve King in my lab, a graduate student. And the colors and the labels here indicate the kinds of tasks that most strongly drive activity in different regions of the cerebellum. Note that only the most anterior regions, those labeled number 1 and 2, are closely linked to movement. Activity in the rest of the cerebellum is more closely associated with functions such as action observation, attention, language comprehension, even autobiographical memory. Images such as these may prove helpful in exploring why cerebellar dysfunction is associated with psychiatric disorders such as autism and schizophrenia. Now, as you heard earlier, Silvia Bunge has a longstanding interest in using network analyses to examine reasoning skills. The colors here, the red and yellow, highlight 2 brain networks, one that is active when people are engaged in goal-oriented behavior, and the other when people are allowed to quietly ruminate. She and others have repeatedly observed that the decoupling of these 2 networks is highly associated with performance on various cognitive tasks. That is, better performance is associated with greater independence of the 2 networks. However, in a recent study, Silvia and her colleagues have observed that this relationship is reversed in kids who grow up in an impoverished environment. Now, the reasons for this remain to be worked out, but her studies point to how the methods of cognitive neuroscience can help provide mechanistic explanations for the complex interaction of the multiple factors that impact brain development and organization. Now, the newest member of our cognitive neuroscience group is Kevin Weiner, and he's really pioneering a new era in neuroanatomy, or what he calls cognitive neuroanatomy. He's developed sophisticated tools to take a close look at the structure of the cortical surface. The light regions on this flat map here correspond to the parts of the cortex that are within the convolutions, the so-called sulci. And Kevin is discovering that within these folds, there are microfolds, or what he calls tertiary sulci. The numbered regions in this image are a series of such tertiary sulci within the prefrontal cortex. These are structural deformations that have really been ignored ever since researchers have studied the human brain. And these appear to increase the cortical surface and thus add to the brain's capacity. Indeed, the size and depth of these sulci across individuals are correlated with performance on different reasoning tasks. So let me close by advertising the latest tool in our arsenal. Our Brain Imaging Center has just installed a new high-powered MRI system. While there are magnets of similar strength at various universities, a collaboration between Berkeley neuroscientists, engineers, and MR physicists has designed specialized electronics that will provide the highest resolution yet achieved in fMRI. And here's one of the first images from the system, with the orange and yellow highlighting individual layers or different layers of the cerebral cortex, images that have never been seen in vivo in the human brain. This new system is also emblematic of why our cognitive neuroscience is well positioned to remain at the cutting edge of science. The campus strength in the social, life, and physical sciences, as well as the history of collaboration across disciplines, is the seed corn for new innovations. Stay tuned.
Thanks so much, Rich, for telling us about your work and that of many of our colleagues here in neuroscience. Our last but not least lightning speaker is Rudy, who's a professor here in social personality psychology. He co-directs the Relationships and Social Cognition Lab. His talk today is called Rethinking Graduate Education for Equity. Rudy?
Rhona, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's attention and everyone's time in celebrating the work of the psychology department here. I hope that you can see my screen. As Serena mentioned, we are trying to rethink graduate education for equity. As Dean Ray mentioned, I think a lot of eyes are on the work that our department does with respect to how to move forward, not only as a field, but also in terms of graduate education more generally. I'll remind you of Professor Weinstein's comments about the struggles and the battles to achieve some kind of gender equity at Cal. And that struggle has had advances, and yet we still struggle in some respects. I want to share with you some data here. This is data about the PhD exit survey. Those of you who graduated from Cal with your PhDs might remember taking a brief one-page survey. It's a requirement for graduation. So you have a 99% response rate. This is just a sampling from a paper that we published a few years ago, where we looked at a slice of PhD respondents between 1998 and 2013, focusing specifically here in the STEM sciences. And what I want to point out to you here is, if you look, there's in the 15 years between 98 and 2013, you have about 5,000 PhD recipients in the STEM fields. About 1,500 of whom were women, 215 of whom were underrepresented minorities. That's the URM designation currently used by the National Science Foundation. But if you notice, in math and physics, in 15 years, Cal graduated 55 women in math, 26 underrepresented scholars, 65 women in physics, 23 underrepresented scholars. Cal is not alone in this paucity of underrepresented scholars and women in the fields. Cal is very representative of those data. Now, in a few years ago, some colleagues, Leslie Simpian and colleagues, asked a few thousand professors in various universities in various fields just to indicate a simple their agreement with whether one needed to have natural inborn brilliance to be successful across the field. And that's graphed in this graph along the x-axis. So the further right you go, the more people agree in a field that a person needs to have natural genius to be successful in that field. What you see on the y-axis or on the vertical line is the proportion of women in that field. And what you see here is an astounding linear relationship between the number of women who are represented in the field and the expectations of genius or brilliance that are expected in that field. Interestingly, you see that math and physics are at the very end of that field, where there's greatest expectations of brilliance, and at the same time, at the level of the country, the fewest representation of women. Philosophy and music composition coming out in the non-STEM fields. The same data is apparent for underrepresented minorities. So this data is telling us that the more people believe that you need to be a genius to succeed, the less diversity there is in that field. Now, the solution, one might say, is to try to dissuade professors that, in fact, one needs to be a genius to succeed in the field. And that's certainly one thing that's argued with the advent, for example, of growth mindset, which some of you may have heard about. But I believe that there's another explanation here. So I'm going to ask you to hold that idea for just a second and talk to you a little bit, just an illustrative example of prejudice and the way that it works. Now, any of you who are familiar with social psychology will know that one of the favorite methods of social psychologists is to present the same stimulus, in this particular case, a resume. It's the exact same resume, and it's paired with either a black job candidate or a white job candidate, so that any differences in how they are evaluated, are as a result of the presumed candidate's race. What you see here is a pattern where it's not that people are prejudiced across the board. When you have a strong resume, there are no differences as a function of how much that candidate is recommended. When the resume is weak, you get a similar pattern where there are no differences. It's when the resume is ambiguous that you have these differences, where prejudice helps fill in the gaps with how people are evaluating the stimulus in front of them. And that's classic psychological knowledge, that people take prior knowledge about their world to try to make sense, particularly of ambiguous stimuli. So we talk about ambiguity as a key process that allows prejudice to develop. As I often tell to my students, and I see some people who've been in my class in the audience, ambiguity is the breeding ground of prejudice. What's the problem? The problem is that the road to the PhD in STEM and in many other fields is that it is a textbook case of ambiguity. People saying, "I'll know genius when I see it," is the very notion that it is up to me to decide whether an idea, whether a method, whether a finding, whether a student is worthy of my support, worthy of my time, worthy of moving forward. And faculty are given that leeway to be able to make those assessments at the same time that they are protected from knowing the steps and requirements and expectations that are necessary for the students to succeed. That doesn't mean that there are no expectations or requirements or expectations. It's just that that knowledge is not uniformly distributed across the students. So if ambiguity is the breeding ground of prejudice, it's not necessarily a conscious or a deliberate process, but rather one where prior knowledge structures like stereotypes, like schemas, then imbue one's perceptions of the ideas and the students, the abilities that one judges as a teacher, as a professor. And I should also say, it goes all the way down so that it is at every level of evaluation, where ambiguity, again, is leading people to be able to use those stereotypes to evaluate the value or the worth of a particular piece of work. So when we talk about expectations of brilliance being related to the diversity in the field, sure, it can be about the thoughts that one has and dissuading people about the presence of genius, but also about the practices through which one identifies such genius. In our work, we have talked about the importance of structure and data to be able to combat these prejudices. Again, not necessarily conscious, but definitely to try to combat the ambiguity of the processes that are happening. What do we mean by data? Data means quite simply collecting data with respect to where the deficiencies are with respect to particular identity groups who are or may not be succeeding in your particular unit, in your particular department, to see where it is that we may not be going well. Oftentimes, we hear from people in leadership positions that they are certain that there is not a problem in X or Y domain, and yet the data may show otherwise. So we need data to be able to tell others as well as ourselves where we need to work. But the other key feature is the idea of structure. Clear expectations, clear requirements that are uniformly known by everybody, and equal access to opportunities, for example, to publish, to present one's work, to be evaluated according to the same criteria. This is, of course, really hard in creative domains such as academia, and yet I think that there are steps that many departments, many academic units can take to be able to create a level playing field so that all students have the opportunity to succeed. I just want to highlight some work that I've been doing with Laura Guzman, a PhD candidate in our area, where we had really a university-wide survey where we asked students as well as faculty about their perceptions of structure in their department. This is actually key because the students as well as the faculty have slightly different versions of what structure means for them. For students, it's clear expectations about the goals and the requirements for moving on, for example, to their qualifying exams or in the next stage of the research. For faculty, it's clarity about the criteria needed, for example, to achieve tenure or to advance in the department. And across both samples with fairly large sample sizes, we see that, that perceptions of structure are associated with sense of belonging, job productivity for faculty, as well as satisfaction from work for both graduate students and faculty. The key here is that we have to be careful that structure is applied evenly and yet doesn't become so tight that it stifles creativity or that it leads to a place where there is not autonomy. So somewhere between structure and autonomy is probably a sweet spot, and that is the research that we're trying to do. If you're interested in this particular idea, I encourage you to look up this particular title, Go Beyond Bias Training, where my colleagues and I talk about some research that we've been doing with respect to this, and it's published in Nature magazine. With that, I want to thank you for your time and your attention and turn it back to Professor Serena Chen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy, and thank you, Silvia, Allison, and Rich as well. Thanks the four of you for sharing, the questions that your graduate postdocs are asking, the answers you're starting to find or you intend to find. I think it's clear from just even the little peek we got into, look at today, at the research that's going on today in the present, that the future is very bright. And on that note, I want to turn to the future, which lies in our students. We're lucky today to have two student representatives, one a doctoral student, one an undergraduate psychology major. They're going to join us today to share their experiences in the psychology department, the impact that these experiences have had, and their plans for the future. It's a pleasure to first introduce our rising graduate student, Monica Elwood-Lowe. Monica is a fifth-year doctoral student working jointly in Mahesh Srinivasan and Silvia Bunge's labs. Monica is really interested in how social inequality affects children's language, cognitive, and brain development. She's also interested in how children are able to adapt and thrive in all different kinds of early environments, and how different patterns of child development interact with larger societal structures to reproduce inequity. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Monica.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you all for being here. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to start with kind of a cheesy story, but I'll try to keep it short, so just bear with me. So this is a story about the very first meeting I ever had with Mahesh Srinivasan and Silvia Bunge. both of my PhD advisors together. And I remember being super nervous about making a good impression and being even more nervous because I wanted to explain and justify my research ideas. And these were ideas that I was kind of used to people in positions of power not taking that seriously. So I'd spent hours in preparation just poring over the tiny details of papers. And I remember sitting down and them turning to me and they asked in the most genuine way, "So what'd you do this weekend?" And maybe that sounds small, but for me, it was such a visceral sign of the culture I was stepping into at Berkeley Psych. And it turns out it wasn't just my advisors. I saw signs of people kind of just caring about each other's humanity and really just caring for one another so many times a day as I bumbled my way through the past 5 years of grad school. And I really believe that this special culture isn't just helpful for our own well-being, but that it's one of the things that keeps us on the frontiers of science. We study people. And I think often when researchers get caught up in sort of the game of academia, they forget that we as people exist in a broader context and in broader societal structures. This is actually what drew me to grad school in the first place. I'd been following a series of studies coming out from research groups around the country, and what they were doing is they were measuring brain development differences between kids who are growing up with more or fewer resources. But reading through these studies, I'd felt such a disconnect between what the researchers proposed these differences could tell us about things like the achievement gap between rich and poor children, and my own experiences growing up in urban public schools in Milwaukee. Rather than reflecting a deficit for the poorer children, which is what most of the research at that time was proposing, I thought maybe these differences in brain development that people were seeing might actually reflect ways kids from all different backgrounds have to adapt to dealing with different sets of constraints and social structures. I thought we might be able to use these differences to better understand and harness the resilience and the skill sets of kids growing up with fewer resources. So I remember when I first introduced these ideas to my advisors, again, very nervously, they did nothing but take me seriously right from the get-go. And it's this kind of environment that I've gotten both from my advisors and from my peers and others in the department that have both nurtured me and pushed me to think more clearly and be a more balanced scientist ever since. And while I hope to continue to pursue this kind of research in years to come, this department isn't just raising the next generation of scientists. It's raising the next generation of leaders in education, in mental health and healthcare, in science communication, in technology. The students who are coming out of our department are going to be the ones who are tasked with fighting climate change, with the push toward anti-racism, and with all of the other challenges that are facing our society right now. So here's something people didn't tell me about grad school when I started, which is that it's taken the better part of my 20s. And when you think about all of the work and the non-work changes that happen over that time, all of the personal and the national events that you never could have predicted, the department where you find yourself really does shape who you come to be. And I have to say, especially with the relief that's come with being back together in person after so much time apart, I genuinely can't think of another place that would have better nurtured me into becoming the kind of researcher, but more importantly, the kind of person that I want to be. I'm so grateful to the Berkeley Psych Department for being the one stable backdrop to the instability of this time, and especially to all of the thoughtful, brilliant, and sweet people who make it up.
Thank you so much, Monica, for giving us all a sense of the community that you've experienced. It's just wonderful to hear. We'll turn now to an undergraduate perspective. We have Harvey Srinivasan, who's going to share his experiences. Harvey is a psychology major, a psychology honor student, a Haas scholar, and he's also minoring right now in disability studies. Harvey's worked in multiple labs in our department and on Brown campus, and he's currently conducting his honors thesis with Dr. Keltner, one of our faculty, on the autistic experience of awe. Harvey, we're going to turn things over to you now, and we're going to hear about your adventures.
Hi, everyone. My name is Harvey Srinivasan. I'm a visionary speaking autistic major in psychology. I know in disability studies. I'm going to continue with my task to speak wise now. Otherwise, we may be here all day listening to my delightful voice.
Coming to Berkeley has been quite transformational for me. I get to do things that would have seemed impossible back in my K to grade 8 special education years. I get to be a Haas scholar and do an honors thesis. I got to work at 2 psychology labs and at the disability lab. I got to teach a decal on autism. I get to write for the Daily Cal. I get to do advocacy at a global level. This is all so exhilarating. Getting featured as one of 3 student activists on President Obama's Instagram was extra icing. I like to think of all the things I get to do now as small pebbles that will widen the ripples in the pond of change. When I first came to Cal, I had no idea of what to expect, especially given my communication and disability challenges. This is me navigating social interactions and group work in various psychology classes. This is not something that is written into academic accommodations. It did need some planning and explaining on my part to make these interactions successful, but I have found my peers pretty accepting and accommodating. And I found other ways to engage with the larger student body. I have thoroughly enjoyed all the psychology classes I've taken. The human mind, physiology, and behavior have always fascinated me. I could not have picked a better major. In fact, I wish I had more units to take all the classes, so I can keep learning. Of course, I was quite nervous about approaching professors, and it would take me over half a semester to pick up the courage to go to office hours. But I have ended up having the most interesting and stimulating conversations with all my professors. I have learned so much in the process, and these interactions just enhanced my learning experience. I especially loved that I was able to apply what I learn in each class. For instance, my classes with Professor Hinshaw and Professor Harvey fueled a presentation on mental health at a local biomed conference as well as a paper on anxiety. Knowledge on sleep in Professor Walker's class translated into a presentation at another biomed conference. I drew parallels to studies discussed in Professor Mendoza Denton's class, in an essay, which went on to being quoted by Time magazine and the UK Independent. Professor Keltner's work on awe is the basis of my current research. This research got a mention at the last public meeting of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, set up by Congress to advise federal policy on autism. For starters, look at the contrast, and where a good number of my autistic versus controls in my research place themselves on the MacArthur social ladder. I am in absolute awe of all the faculty and staff in the psychology department. This is truly an amazing educational experience. I hope I can continue to conduct research, engage in teaching in some form, and perhaps work with a policy think tank. The nature of my disabilities will mean that my exact career path is likely to be non-traditional, where I am able to capitalize on both my strengths and work with the challenges of my disability. Real-world issues are cross-disciplinary, and there is so much to learn and contribute using the avenue of research itself as it impacts policy priorities, funding, access, and societal attitudes. The poet in me asks, can the quest for solutions ever end? Never, answers the mind. Take detours, challenge the sinkholes, must persevere. Have to travel possibilities, open opportunities, and pave new roads.
Thank you, Harvey. I know he's out there as well, not just on video. He's here with us tonight. Thank you so much for sharing. I think there would be a strong consensus, your amazing Berkeley journey with us. Can't wait to hear about where you'll go after Cal with all the experiences you have, armed with all these experiences. So this brings us to the final portion of our program tonight. Joining also on video, we have 3 members of our Charter Hill Society for Psychology. What is the Charter Hill Society? It's a community of donors supporting the faculty, wonderful students here in Berkeley Psychology via 3-year commitments to our Psychology Annual Fund. We're really lucky today to have a brief video first from Anjanette Pelletier, who is an undergraduate in our department, like Harvey, class of '92. Anjanette is not just a member of our Charter Hill Society, she's actually the honorary chair this year. Anjanette is currently the Associate Superintendent for San Mateo County Special Education Local Plan Area. Her passions include ensuring quality programming for students with disabilities, for foster youth, and adjudicated youth. And she's very interested in supporting adequate funding for special education. Following Anjanette's video, her remarks, we have a video from Mark and Joy Gall, both of whom received their PhDs from our department in 1968 and 1970, respectively, and they met here at Cal. After leaving, both went on to have full careers, including positions at the University of Oregon School of Education, devoted their careers, their lives to school improvement, teaching university courses and workshops, and by co-authoring books on research methods, teacher education, and study skills. Now retired, they're looking at the next generation of scholars and practitioners like Monica and Harvey, and generously providing their support for their endeavors. So we're going to turn now to these two brief.
Hello, my name is Anjanette Pelletier, and I'm the Charter Hill Society Honorary Chair for Psychology. I'm so happy to be with you today as we celebrate 100 years for UC Berkeley Psychology. I'm so grateful for the education I received at Cal, and I hope that we have 100 more years of excellence for UC Berkeley Psychology. Happy anniversary, and go Bears.
My wife Joy and I are happy to join you in celebrating the Psychology Department's 100-year anniversary. We know the department well. We earned our doctorates there in the latter part of the 1960s. Joy and I are extremely grateful to the faculty for teaching us the skills that we used in our careers. Joy and I recently expressed our appreciation for all that the Department of Psychology taught us by creating an endowed fund to support its present and future doctoral students. I trust that other graduates will feel the same way as we do, giving back to the department for all that it gave to us. We believe that endowments such as ours will enable present and future doctoral students to conduct research that will improve the human condition in fundamental ways. Once again, congratulations to the Psychology Department on its 100-year anniversary. Keep it going.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Anjanette and Mark and Joy, for sharing with us today and for being with us on video. Just today's kickoff of, I want to thank again each and every one of the speakers, our Emeritus, our 4 lightning speakers, and our 2 students for being here today and sharing their perspectives, research, and experiences with us. I want to also give a shout out to the wonderful staff in the Social Sciences Division for helping to put this event together, especially to Christian Gordon, Hagit Hasby, Anya Isunima, Debbie Kelly, and Chuck Kapelke. Thank you so much. And last but not least, thank you all for taking the time this evening to gather here today to help us kick off our Berkeley Psychology's 100th anniversary celebratory year. There will be more events come the spring, so please be on the look on our website. We'll also get messaging. We have an event coming up soon in January. There should be a slide coming up in a moment showing this event. We have Jack Allen, who you heard a little bit about in Rich's talk. There'll be an event on Thursday, January 20th, and you'll get information. I think it might be in the chat. Yes, it's in the chat if you want to register for this event now, or you can visit our 100th anniversary year link on our psychology homepage to get registration information there. Okay, then, thank you all again for being here tonight. And of course, we need to end things with saying, go Bears. Thanks again, guys. Thanks.